all eyes are on the continuing trade tensions between the world's two largest economies, US and China.
We believe that America's destiny is to dominate every industry, and we are way ahead of China.
But the Chinese have learned from the first trade war during Trump's inaugural term.
That was like a wake-up call for China. It revealed the risk of over-relying on foreign technologies from the US.
What cards does Beijing now hold 6 months into this trade conflict?
China does seem to have the upper hand because it's a manufacturing superpower.
China has been using rare earths as a tool of political coercion for more than 15 years.
Do you really expect that you can levy such pressure against China and force China down?
August 12th, the US and China barely extended their trade truce hours before it was set to expire, staving off a huge spike in tariffs, at least for now. While the US has reportedly worked out trade deals with the EU, Japan, and South Korea, a pact with the Chinese has been elusive. The current truce will only last till November 10th.
So the United States is in the process of renegotiating its trade relationships with all of its trading partners. And that's largely a response to the US running massive trade deficits with many of its partners, including China, but also Europe and other countries in Asia. So what's happening is a really global phenomena. It's not directed at just Asia or just China, but really it's the nature of the US economic relationship with the rest of the world.
China wants to make sure that no country in the world should be allowed to impose its will on China or on the Chinese people.
That a trade agreement between the world's two largest economies has not been reached may be more than Beijing being a hard negotiator. Instead, in this trade conflict, some believe China will come out on top.
China wants to do whatever that can be done to make sure that the tariff war will be resolved amicably. But if Washington really chooses to continue to fight the tariff war, China will fight to the very end.
If China appears more assertive this time round, why is that so? This factory in China's Silicon Valley, Shenzhen, may provide some clues. These are tiny cameras manufactured by Union Imaging. They may be small, but they hold very big possibilities.
除了我们的手机摄像头的这一个小部分外，那么我们还覆盖了很多的领域，像我们常见的像扫地机的领域，还有像我们的像无人机的领域，就是物流的这种无人机的领域，还有像物流车的领域啊，以及说机器视觉的、工业视觉的机器人的具身机器人的领域。
Founded in 2014, Union Imaging has been pushing the boundaries of imaging technology.
这款的话是我们的一个直播产品，因为现在的话整个直播的发展非常快，而我们的产品的话，它可以接入多个直播平台。然后这里边的话，像无人机类的产品，会议类的产品，还有这种星空望远镜的产品。
But at one time, China would have had to import such electronics. When the East Asian nation joined the WTO in 2001, it was a net importer of technological goods. It quickly began to produce and export low-tech products. For advanced components like chips and complex electronics, China had to rely on others, including the US. Until recently, when it finally became a net exporter.
This is really a journey of 1,000 miles. In the past 25 years, China's R&D spending has increased by more than 20-fold. We're talking about it from the government perspective. Reaching the high-tech status is very necessary because they believe this is the only way China can do to fend off the threat from the US.
In 2007, China spent $136 billion on research and development. This was less than a third of what the US was spending. But by 2023, That figure grew 6 times to $781 billion. That puts China closely behind the US, which spent $823 billion that same year. As a result, China's import dependency of tech for sectors like aerospace, advanced electronics, robotics, and others have drastically reduced.
The China-US relationship is basically beyond salvation, regardless of what's going on in the short term. So the government is very keen to invest way more in the emerging industries, in the strategic sectors, at the price of short-term growth slowdown.
And what could have cemented this idea of self-reliance among the Chinese leadership can be traced to Trump's first term as president. In 2018, President Trump accused China of unfair trade practices and intellectual property theft. He slapped tariffs on a range of Chinese goods like solar panels, steel, and washing machines.
I think since the first trade tensions that they experienced back in 2018, that was like a wake-up call for China, right? It revealed the risk of over-relying on foreign technologies from the US, and since then, China has moved rather quickly to build a more self-reliant and resilient economy.
从2018年开始，对中国最大的意义来讲，我们知道说，我们必须对自己的发展有自己的话语权。我们既要融入国际的贸易环境当中，同时，不能被过于的针对。在博弈和合作的这种过程当中呢，我们既要有自己核心的东西。
China initially responded to the 2018 tariffs with tit-for-tat measures, but it would eventually sign a deal with the US.
The first trade war really caught Chinese government off guard, so they were very reactive and receptive of a lot of the requests that the US side proposed. China basically accepted most of the requirement from the US.
Signed in 2020, the Phase 1 deal was aimed at resolving trade tensions. It required China to increase purchases of US goods by $200 billion over a 2-year period. Though by the end of 2021, China purchased only about 60% of the agreed amount due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, 5 years on, the US is finding a different China across the negotiating table.
So the second trade war is a turning point, actually, on China's stance against the US. Previously, it's more of the US leading this trade war, trying to force China to agree to buy more, to invest more in the US. So we can safely say that now the intention for decoupling is mutual.
One of the things that China has done is really to build self-reliance and a resilient economy, especially in areas like semiconductors, energy, and artificial intelligence.
China's quest to overcome America's tech advantage may be helped by domestic policies stateside. In 2025, President Trump slashed funding budgets across health, science, and energy research.
So the US government is going through a process of rationalization. And there's also a push towards austerity, reducing government spending to also reduce federal spending deficits and try to balance its federal budget. They're having a more realist eye placed upon some of these programs to see how do they directly benefit the American taxpayer that's underwriting and funding these programs.
The signal sent out is quite worrying because at this point, US is still the #1 choice for top talents in the world. If you ask a brilliant Chinese student where they want to end up studying or working for a research institution, they would probably say still the US, despite of all those bilateral deterioration.
And so, in a March 2025 poll by a scientific journal, 75% of the US-based scientists were thinking of leaving the country due to disruptions in funding. Some have already left for China.
The brain drain is quite significant, but as we can see, top talents, especially in the AI industry, they still choose to stay in the US. The freedom to run research, the way to allocate budget, and also how much you should follow the government agenda. These are all very real barriers when it comes to their job decision.
China has also prepared for the trade war in other ways. Anstey Technology is a company that makes cables, headphones, and power banks. Based in the manufacturing hub of Foshan, the company ships their products around the globe. And there is one market the company is moving away from.
Before the trade war 2018, our many products contributed in U.S. market over 30%. Now have to down half, about 15%. Why I changed the focus on American market to the developing countries? Number one, because the developing countries now increasing the demand over more than 50%. Second reason is because the American policy is certainly not stable. So this reason makes me choose more of developing countries to cooperate.
Since the first trade war, China has reduced its reliance on the US as a market. In 2018, about 20% of Chinese total exports were destined for the US. By 2024, it was less than 15%.
As far as China's concerned, the United States is not the totality of the world. Therefore, if we assume the worst-case scenario, then China will do several things. One is China will stimulate the domestic consumption for the products which were originally produced, intended for the US market. Secondly, China will find whatever alternative markets in the rest of the world and try to export the products there too.
China is looking to other markets to export to. But will there be willing buyers? The Thai capital, Bangkok, is a retail heaven. But among local Thai brands, new stores are popping up.
ครับจริงๆก็เห็นตลอดในชีวิตประจำวันนะครับไม่ว่าจะเป็นร้านอาหารหรือว่าร้านขายปลีกขายส่งอะไรเงี้ยครับก็เห็นมาตลอดว่าธุรกิจจีนเข้ามามีบทบาทถ้าเป็นโทรศัพท์ผมนึกถึงเสี่ยวมี่นะฮะแล้วก็อย่างที่เรากินทุกวันอะไรเงี้ยฮะก็มิเฉที่เป็นน้ำปั่น
รถไฟฟ้าค่ะที่เข้ามาก็ค่อนข้างเยอะเลยค่ะคนไทยก็นิยมเพราะว่ามันประหยัดด้วยแล้วก็ราคาถูก
As China pulled back from the US market, it has turned to its neighborhood to absorb its exports.
In recent years, we saw the ASEAN group of economies overtake the US as China's largest export destination back in 2022, and that was supported by various trade agreements like the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which have reduced tariffs and improved market access.
In 2024, Chinese exports to Southeast Asia reached a record of $587 billion. This April, as exports to the US fell, shipments to ASEAN surged over 20% year-on-year, with Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam being the top 3 destinations. Beijing has also sought to strengthen trade ties with the EU, Japan, and South Korea. Such trade relations could strengthen China's position.
China will always care about improving its relations with any country in the world, all the countries in the world. Europe should not view China as a rival or as an enemy or as an adversary. And our economies, even up to today, are still highly complementary to each other. We have different strengths and weaknesses, and we can really help each other to grow in a mutually respectful way. Likewise, China keeps buying tremendous amount of goods from Australia, not only iron ore, but beef, dairy products, wheat of all kinds, and also manufactured products.
So if we see a decline in US demand for Chinese exports, other markets can certainly absorb some, but this cannot completely offset the drop in demand from the US. right? The US is still a major and important trading partner for China. Other alternative markets, they just simply don't have the same scale or purchasing power to replace US demand.
What's more, the flood of goods from China has not been entirely welcomed.
We have seen a lot of competition in the market, especially for ultra-low price solar panel from Chinese manufacturer, either by subsidies of the company in China or by the economy of scale of their supply chain, which is huge.
Solar PPM is a Thai solar panel company based in Bangkok. Founded in 2016, the company provides solar panels and installation to residents and businesses. It's one of the few homegrown solar firms left in Thailand, as the sector has struggled from competition from China. China dominates the global solar industry, built up through government subsidies.
The price that Chinese manufacturers offer is barely above the cost that we build the solar panel locally here. So if you want to compete on the price, you cannot. In Thailand, my country, we barely have any support from the government compared to Chinese manufacturer, which they have a lot of support from the government. Even some of the company is owned by the government.
In 2004, China produced less than 2% of the world's solar cells. By 2024, that number soared to more than 80%. China is also the dominant producer of EVs, electronics, computer parts, and machinery.
So in terms of scale, availability of the technology and the knowledge, the Chinese government have developed, given a lot of support to Chinese producers to get out of the comfort zone and be able to invest more in innovation. You can say that from mobile phones to some very cheap toys, they can produce all of them, and they would be able to compete them in terms of scale and in terms of quality as well, which a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, we do not have that technology.
An April 2025 survey of Thai SMEs found that over 70% believe that they will lose market share to Chinese imports. And some businesses want their governments to shield them from Chinese competitors.
For short term, anti-dumping is the must, mainly because right now the market is flooded by Chinese panel. The price is very low. We cannot have a room to breathe. Don't mention about the profit, just only the cash flow. Secondly, the midterm, we can stimulate the demand in the market. For example, you give the promotion to the customer for the panel or the equipment made locally.
In 2024, the Thai government started collecting a 7% value-added tax on imported goods priced less than 1,500 Thai baht. The move was largely aimed at cheap Chinese products. Indonesia has also considered putting a 200% tariff on Chinese imports.
Other countries have major challenges in their own relationships with China. They see challenges with opening up their own markets to Chinese goods, which could undermine their own ability to develop manufacturing or move up value chains, or in some cases just maintain employment in lower-end sectors like garments.
We have to start seriously thinking about is how we're going to develop the capabilities of our SMEs to be able to compete with Chinese products. If we can't compete with them, then what are the alternatives that we have? What are the products that we have that might be needed in China, and how could we cater to those needs? I think that is something that I think a lot of countries in Southeast Asia have to start thinking about very clearly.
The trade relation between China and ASEAN is complex. China does not only sell finished consumer goods to the region. Instead, about 3/4 of Chinese exports to Southeast Asia are intermediate or capital goods. These are items needed to make other products. One reason for this is that since Trump's first trade war, China has moved some of its manufacturing to Southeast Asia.
The Southeast Asia region has become one of the key hotspots for these Chinese manufacturers, especially in countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. That's in part due to their relatively lower cost of labor and production, as well as its close proximity to China. Now this shift has helped Chinese manufacturers reduce their exposure to US tariffs, at the same time still maintain that kind of market access.
Trade barriers are usually applied according to what is known as rules of origin, the economic nationality of a product, based on how much of it is manufactured in a particular country. By importing parts and assembling it in a third country, for example, Vietnam, Chinese companies can label their products made in Vietnam, thereby skirting tariffs that cover Chinese goods. In some cases, a product may alter its origin even though it only goes through minimal cosmetic or packaging changes. This is typically prohibited in trade agreements.
Especially for Thailand, I don't think we have a very clear rule of origin of how many percentage of production needs to be done in Thailand, and that would be re-exported. So this is how China has been working in order to access American markets since the first trade war.
A 2025 report by a Thai bank estimated that nearly 3,000 companies may be fronts for Chinese products misrepresenting the origin of goods. But the US is looking to close this loophole. In July, Vietnam and the US reached a deal to lower tariffs to 20%. The Trump administration had originally imposed a rate of 46%. However, the agreement also included a 40% tariff on transshipment goods. Transshipment refers to goods that are transferred from one transport to another in an intermediate country. Similarly, Indonesia said it would prevent transshipment to preserve its trade deal with the US. Whether Chinese companies continue to take advantage of the loophole depend on these partners enforcing the restrictions.
So a country with good governance, like Vietnam, like Thailand, and if they're willing to establish regimes that certify exports as being legitimately having content from particular countries that's clearly and transparently identified, some countries will be very successful in that. In other countries where governance is weaker, where corruption is higher, that's going to be much more difficult. And I think fraudulent companies that are intent on transshipment will find those jurisdictions where governance is weak, where corruption is high, and they'll try to beat the system.
In the end, how China weathers the trade tensions with the US depends on the actions of the mutual trade partners.
So even for countries like Vietnam, like Cambodia, they would enjoy more of a trade relations with China, but they also want to develop their indigenous innovation capacity. So for China, this diversification strategy is kind of reaching a limit that kind of forced China to change its strategy. It can't just make money on its own, and it also has to open up more of its own market to those countries that want to invest in. So it's more of a shared future.
With Southeast Asia pushing back on the flood of Chinese goods, will China's own market be able to absorb them? At this research lab in Shanghai, scientists are developing new ways to clean water.
目前我们这些设备主要应用的领域在比如说黑臭水体的治理啊，河湖水库的污染物治理啊，藻华现象的处理，还有地下水和那个直饮水的2次供水，还有离网供水设备。
The company uses hydroxyl radicals, a powerful oxidizing agent, to break down various organic pollutants and microorganisms. This process leaves behind minimal byproducts, making it an environmentally friendly way for water treatment. A possible use case? Disinfecting swimming pools. An application that could be lucrative if they can capture the US market.
市场需求在美国北美地区是非常大的，两个国家的市场都非常大，只不过美国的家用市场的需求一定是比中国市场大的， 因为毕竟两个国家的文化、生活环境、习惯都不太一样。比如说，美国人已经非常习惯于自己家里有个大的别墅，然后里面挖一个泳池。但是中国在北上广深，我想对于绝大多数居民来讲，还是很难实现这件事情的。
The trade war has, however, muddied the waters.
这个贸易战对我们这个对美国的一个销售份额的冲击其实是非常明显的，因为它来得很突然，然后这样我们销售额从接近50%，现在降到现在不到20%。那我们是一个制造型的企业，所以说我们其实初期是相对被动的，必须调整，然后要去消化这些产能，怎么去解决这些问题。
Any trade war or tariffs is going to affect the Chinese. I guess presumably you can diversify, selling to Southeast Asia, selling to Europe. I think most of us would acknowledge that American market still represents a pot of gold.
The year-on-year economic growth for China in the first quarter and second quarter of 2025 were 5.4% and 5.2% respectively, surpassing the government target of around 5%. But with tariffs starting to bite, analysts expect China's growth to slow in the second half of the year.
I think right now, the US and China would have to find a way to some kind of working arrangement. And the Chinese have also said that we are able to suffer. We have a greater tolerance for suffering.
Now, China has been here for 5,000 years minimum. And during most of the time, there was no United States. Now, we want to get along with the United States, of course. The Chinese people highly respect the American people. But if the US government wants to fight this trade war against China and try to bully China, then there is only one thing for the Chinese people to do. We will need to deal with the situation without the United States, and we expect to live for another 5,000 years without the United States.
But how much can China endure should a long-term trade deal remain elusive? After all, in April 2025, China's youth unemployment rate remains relatively high. It was 15.8%, though slightly down from the 16.5% in March. However, the rate could go up again as 12 million fresh graduates enter the job market this summer.
主要是找文职，然后拍摄之类的这种类型的工作。求职时间现在已经有8个月了。
28-year-old Yuzu has a master's degree in sociology from Wuhan University, one of the top universities in China. She found a job and worked for a year at a tech company after graduating, but was laid off in November last year. She's been on the job hunt since.
其实我会愿意在同等的这些公司里面找，因为一方面跳槽，在这些公司里会更好跳，他会看重你之前有过的大厂经历。那么，但是在我在找工作的过程当中，我还是很明显的感觉到，就是现在的这些大厂其实给出来的职位，我就是觉得普遍的在缩减，他现在的工作就没有之前那么好找。So China's youth unemployment problem, I think, is more structural than cyclical. There is a growing mismatch between job seekers' skills and what's available out there. As millions of graduates enter into the workforce each year, there just isn't enough white-collar positions out there to meet that kind of demand. And on the other hand, we still see vacancies and job postings for blue-collar roles. Now, the second contributing factor is, I think, is a slowdown in the private sector, right? Especially in areas like, tech and real estate. And, that's worrying for the young people because these industries typically tend to hire a bulk of these young graduates.
If trade tensions are prolonged, these graduates will enter a gloomy jobs market. A research report by investment bank Natixis said that if US tariffs are at least 30%, exports to the US would fall by half. This would result in a loss of up to 6 million Chinese manufacturing jobs. In another survey of American companies operating in China, less than half intend to invest in the country this year. A sharp drop from last year's 80%.
These trade uncertainties really create problems for the businesses, and that's holding back hiring appetite and making them cautious to employ more people. right? And there's a ripple effect to other industries like services or even the informal sectors, for example.
不管是求职者还是在职者，其实大家心里都是有一点点恐惧的。现在都不是说什么还不错的工作，就是可能工作完全都找不到，在这个贸易摩擦的这种情况下。
Even before the tariffs, sentiment in China was muted. Last year, more than a third of Chinese consumers reported anxiety over job security, and close to half of the urban population see the job market as challenging. This, in turn, may have led consumers to hold back on spending. Last year, a record high of 64% Chinese households said they would rather save money than spend or invest it.
China is facing a consumer demand that is very weak and soft, right? And front and center of those household concerns really is the downturn in the property market, which started back in 2022. And that's concerning for households because that's where a bulk of their wealth is stored at. That's going to put real pressure on their budgets. And in turn, that has, caused them to turn to savings instead of spending.
When consumers cut back on purchases of goods and services, this could lead to a deflationary spiral. It is when prices start to fall due to weak demand or excess supply, so customers spend less, expecting prices to fall further. Businesses under pressure continue to cut prices and lay off workers. To stimulate demand, China has poured billions into a consumer trade-in program. The program encourages people to exchange old goods for new ones at a government-subsidized discount. In 2025, China spent $42 billion funding the scheme, double that of last year.
Ultimately, to turn consumer confidence around, it really takes more than just subsidies and trade-in schemes, right? What the country really needs is a deeper structural reform.
Unwritten social contract in China has been the case where the government, led by the Chinese Communist Party, provides economic growth in exchange for the Chinese citizens' loyalty and obedience. And we have seen over the last couple of years pockets of unhappiness. Of course, these are not manifested in a big way, but if you follow Chinese social media, you have trends like the lying flat, rotting sort of syndrome going on, which suggests that people are unhappy about the economic prospects of China moving forward.
Yet, perhaps the trade war has given the Chinese leadership some breathing room. By shifting the blame for the economic doldrums to their American adversary.
美方仍在对中国滥施关税，一味地进行极限施压，对这种霸道霸凌行径，中方坚决反对。
The elites are obviously rallying around the flag because that's what they're expected to. The elites are speaking with one voice in the sense that Americans are the cause of this trade war and they would have to first apologize. It's not a case where every Chinese person sees America as essentially the problem maker. I think some of them also recognize there are internal problems within China.
I think there are lots of pains in China. I come across lots of smaller and medium-sized private enterprises. They are scrambling to readjust to the huge disruption or the pending disruption caused by the trade war. However, I think the people are fully united in achieving one thing. That is, China cannot lose this tariff war imposed by the United States. Of course, there will be huge losses in China. Many companies may be closed, many people may be laid off. But China cares more about other things, which may be more important than the pure calculation of economic gains or the losses. China cares about its sovereignty more than anything else.
While American and Chinese trade negotiators continue to work out a deal, what role will domestic pressure play?
The Chinese have also said that we have a greater tolerance for suffering. That might swing it in the Chinese favor because the Americans got elections to contend with. If the economy is not doing well, people are going to vote. I would say the Chinese also want to have a positive relationship with the United States. The problem right now we see is, of course, nationalism in both capitals, and this is making it very difficult for the elites to sort of concede some ground without projecting to their own people that they are weak.
Can China outlast the US in a protracted trade war? When President Trump unleashed tariffs on most of America's trading partners early into his term, the stated intent was to bring back jobs to the US. And some of his tactics may be working.
There are some areas of our business that we absolutely are seeing increased demand, and so we're tooling up and expanding the team to address that demand.
Based in Elwood City in Pennsylvania, Elwood produces specialty metals and metal parts. The family-run business has been around for 115 years and supports Trump's approach to trade.
Somebody has to stand up to address the unfair trade practices that China and other countries are engaging in. It may not be a perfect approach and it needs refinement, but Elwood absolutely supports Trump's strong stance on protecting domestic manufacturing via trade remedies.
In June, the US slapped a 50% tariff on steel and aluminum imports, double of what was previously announced. The only trading partner spared was the UK, with a rate of 25%. The president has said that tariffs are necessary to protect US industries and bring back manufacturing jobs.
In some areas of our business, we've increased hiring and are moving forward with investments. For example, in our specialty metals, high-performance alloys, vacuum induction melting investment that we're moving forward with right now, full steam ahead. And we feel that there's continued increased demand in that area, and tariffs will benefit it.
However, on the whole, manufacturing jobs are sliding. According to US federal data, the manufacturing sector lost a combined 14,000 jobs in May and June. Furthermore, July's job growth was just 73,000, while the figures for May and June were revised down by about 250,000. The pace of US job creation this year is the weakest in decades, apart from periods of recession.
For the longest time, American prosperity, for better or worse, has been premised upon that model, where you sort of let other countries make these things as cheaply and as efficiently, and that includes having the supply chains being farmed out to these countries. Today, to bring it back, it means an entire reshuffling of the supply chains. Again, I'm not saying it cannot be done, but it means a lot of business uncertainty and turbulence.
Part of the uncertainty is flip-flopping on tariff rates. Manufacturers are asked to build factories in the US to avoid tariffs. But this capital investment may not pay off if tariffs later get cut.
In America, the political cycles are 4 years? So if I was a businessman, I would hedge my bets. I wouldn't sort of say, okay, because the US president wants to bring manufacturing back, therefore let's pack up our factories in China or elsewhere and move back to America. That ain't going to happen in the short run.
So I think there's evidence that President Trump's policies are certainly having an effect on some sectors. It's creating chaos in others. So I think President Trump has indicated that there will be permanent tariffs placed on U.S. trading partners. So I think it's very unlikely that the U.S. will go to zero on any of them. So I think that's going to be a feature of the U.S. trade relationship with the rest of the world going forward.
In this small town, about half-hour drive from Pittsburgh, is Lockjaw Premium Adhesives. The company sells items like packing tape, stretch film, and thermal labels. Lockjaw prides itself on providing high-quality items at a low cost. But to do that, it relies on Chinese imports.
China, what they specialize in is they are experts at creating commodity, low-cost items that are widely utilized in America, and they do it with a level of precision and consistency that's unmatched. The labor factor is about 1/10 what it is in the United States. The second reason, in the United States, the regulation to manufacture them is significantly higher than they are overseas. So for example, tape. Tape is very regulated, tape manufacturing in the United States. Overseas in China, you could make it in a teepee. And if the tape sticks, okay, it's good tape.
Eric has been relying on his suppliers and bulk purchases to keep his business afloat. However, trade tensions threaten to hurt his company.
So I can have an order for $1 million from a customer, and I don't know if a tariff is going to be 30% or 150%. One I can make money on, the other I lose my pants on. And that uncertainty, it's very stressful. So right now, the way to overcome it is it's really all based on relationships. It's trust. It's being able to, say to your partner factory or your freight forward, hey, I'm good for this order. And they're coming back to you and say, well, then we're good, in locking you in on this price. It's all about who your trading partners are and how close and storied those relationships are.
Right now, China does seem to have the upper hand, and precisely because it's a manufacturing superpower. One thing to China's favor is that it actually takes decades to establish a complete supply chain that China is enjoying right now. And we often talk about the formidable China's processing capacity of a rare earth.
For many observers, China's hold on rare earth elements is its trump card in trade negotiations. These are metallic elements like neodymium, praseodymium, and terbium, used to make superconductors, lasers, powerful magnets, and other components. And China dominates the industry. It's the world's largest producer of rare earths, accounting for around 70% of global rare earth mining and 90% of the refining of these minerals.
The environmental costs with extracting those rare earth resources are very high, and most countries in the West don't want to do it. So for a long time, the Chinese could do it. So I think that gave China this window of opportunity to sort of make sure that they have got leverage over it.
In April 2025, China implemented export controls on 7 rare earth elements and rare earth magnets. Such magnets are found in things from EVs to defense systems. While both sides reached a temporary deal in June, China agreed to approve export licenses for rare earths to the US, while the US pledged to relax countermeasures against China.
China has been using rare earths as a tool of political coercion for more than 15 years. I think in 2010, they cut off rare earths exports to Japan over a territorial dispute in the Senkaku Islands. So since that point, countries have been looking for ways to reduce their dependence on Chinese rare earths. The US has been investing in its own supply chains, and I think that's really the blowback from China's effort to use rare earths as a tool of political coercion.
In July, the US Department of Defense announced a $400 million investment in MP Materials, an American rare earth miner and producer. The company owns the only operational rare earth mine in the US at Mountain Pass, California. But a shift from Chinese dependency will be difficult.
It actually takes about 30 to 40 years to achieve what China achieved now. You have to have all those years of initial investment. You have to have a central government that has the fiscal capacity to actually provide a subsidy to direct funds into those areas. So for the US in the short term, it can't escape China.
On August 1st, the Trump administration's tariff regime kicked in for most of the world, including a 15% duty on most EU goods and an increased 35% tariff on Canadian products. China has been keen to court these regions, alienated by the Americans. For example, a tentative deal to lift rare earth export restrictions to the EU was discussed in the EU-China summit in July.
the fundamental question whether there is mutual trust. And China and Canada doesn't have that mutual trust. China and the EU doesn't have that mutual trust. Even for China and other BRICS countries, there are some gaps going on, and it's not easy to be closed. So for the US to, as we often say, sabotage its allies, China doesn't necessarily gain just by the loss in the US. There are more concessions that China has to make. For example, by opening up more of its financial market to, say, the European companies, to Canadian companies, to Australian companies, but so far, there's not much movement in that direction.
The Trump administration claims that they have already reached a deal with EU. Now EU is backing up. The Trump administration claims that they have reached a deal with Japan. Japan says, no, there is nothing signed up. We do not know what exactly Washington is talking about.
With the US and China working to hammer out a deal, who will eventually come out on top?
Despite all the talks about raising more tariffs, containing China, the US relies on China for a lot of the key inputs for industries and for consumers. So China does have a few years to actually enjoy sort of upper hand in this trade war.
So I think we're in a period of pretty extreme competition between the US and China. It's not just about trade. And many of those fundamental differences and competitive elements in the relationship are structural at this point. They're not going to change just because a trade agreement can be reached. And I think if I had to predict, it's going to be very difficult for China to open its markets to the United States more fully. It's going to be difficult to have a truly reciprocal relationship that President Trump seeks, because China has its own industrial policies where it's seeking to actively reduce its own dependence on foreign markets and imports from abroad.
The excess capacity is a problem, because what are you going to do with those extra cars, and you can't eat them, and they need to figure out a way how best to bring its biggest consumer, the United States, back on its, I wouldn't say good books, but back on its side.
While China is always very serious, always very committed to discussing the details, it seems that the United States keeps moving its goalpost. I don't think anyone will emerge as a winner because of the trade war. The trade war is comprehensively and overarchingly destructive because it disrupts free trade. And free trade is what makes the world as it is today.